I'm glad we had a moment of silence for 9/11. I was in Washington, D.C., running the Kennedy Foundation at that time, 2 blocks from the White House. And of course, we heard the news, and we were worried that the third plane, the one that went down in Pennsylvania, was going to crash either into the Capitol or the White House. I sent my staff all home because they had children in school and nobody knew what was happening, and it was a really tough day. But I want us to have, this is 22 years later, and a lot has happened in the United States since 9/11. In some ways, I think we are meaner than we used to be. We argue about who's the most patriotic, and we think that it's okay for us to put other Americans down so that we can puff ourselves up. I think that's probably what the guys who crashed the planes wanted to happen. I think that the terrorists didn't just want to destroy that building or crash into the Pentagon or kill 3,000 people. I think they wanted to start tensions among us in this country and start to undermine the democracy that we have. And the recognition, I'm not saying that it used to be sunshine and roses. I was a Kennedy Fellow. I worked for a Republican when I was in the Senate. I worked for Senator Frist from Tennessee. And there were arguments then. I mean, I tried to pass the Developmental Disabilities Act while I was there, and one of the Republican staff said to me, well, this is expensive. And I said, oh, it's only $150 million a year. And she said, well, $150 million here, $150 million there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. But the point from me was that the Developmental Disabilities Act is about people's lives. It's about recognizing that some people in the United States need other people to think about them. We need to be recognized. We need to have systems and communities that work for us. But that was the old Republican Party. Now, I don't think you can even bring something like that forward. And I'm not here as a Democrat, so please, the organizers of this meeting have no idea what I'm going to say. It has nothing to do with them. This is me talking, and I'm retired now, so I can say any old damn thing that I want to say. One of the big pluses of being retired, I might add. But also, I want to point out, when you're with your friends, you can say any old thing that you want to say. So when you're in a room today with people that you know, feel free to say, hey, I didn't agree with this thing that speaker said, or I'm worried about this that's happening in my community. So for 9/11, instead of a moment of silence, I want to go on what Deb was saying and have a moment of matter. So will you just say as loud as you can, I matter?
I matter.
Now I want everybody to say it all together. I matter. See, I get goosebumps when you guys do that. Because I'm telling you, the people on the Hill don't know that you matter. Probably the people in your state offices don't know that each of you matter. Whether you're a person with a disability, whether you're a parent or a family member of someone with a disability, whether you are a teacher in a school, in an inclusive class, or struggling in a special ed class. It doesn't matter where you are or who you are or where you work. If you work in human services, direct support professional, or you matter. And that's the beauty of the disability system in the United States. So I want to tell you how much people with disabilities matter in the United States. You know, we just had a hurricane come up the coast on the East Coast. Happens every year. Probably the most important hurricane that ever happened in 1774. So Thomas Jefferson, people don't know this about him. Thomas Jefferson had 2 siblings with disabilities. His brother Randolph had what we would obviously now recognize as autism. He himself was recognized as having autistic characteristics, and a few years ago he might have been labeled as having Asperger's syndrome. We don't use that term anymore, but he also had a sister, Elizabeth, who had pretty significant intellectual disabilities. In the language of their time, she was called an imbecile. That was the language that they used. But what it meant is that she probably had 4 or 5 words that she could say, and that was all. So she was very disabled, even though they didn't have the term disability. So they're living at Monticello. His sister is there. His mother was taking care of his sister, and then his mother said, Thomas, I'm going to go up to Boston and help your other brother with his children, so you have to take care of Elizabeth now. So Thomas wrote to James Madison and the other founding fathers and said, I'm really sorry, but I have to back away from doing the work that we were doing on founding a new nation because I'm going to be really busy taking care of my sister. The first failure of family support in the United States. And then, 2 years later, in 1770, just almost 76, there was a hurricane, came all the way into Monticello in Virginia, and coincidentally, there was an earthquake at the same time. And Elizabeth probably had anxiety, like a lot of people with disabilities do, ran from the house, was followed by her servant, and they both drowned. They found their bodies 2 weeks later in a river nearby. She was seeking safety and she died. At which time Thomas Jefferson wrote to the other founding fathers and said, I am very, very sad to report that I am now free to join you again in the work that we're doing to try to create a new nation. And then he wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I submit to you that he wrote that as the brother of a woman with intellectual disability. When he said, and he didn't say all people, he said all men, but come on. When he wrote it, he was including Elizabeth in this statement. This was the first statement of human rights ever in the history of the world. This was the first time anyone had said that we all have the same equal rights based on our common humanity. It's the basis of everything that drives what we try to do with disability and community in the United States. You cannot get more conservative than the Declaration of Independence. I'm sorry. You can't. There is nothing more fundamental than that opening statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We don't need outcome measures. We don't need cost accounting. We don't need anything else. They are self-evident truths that all people are created equal. Now, in 1941 until 1945, you know World War II was proving that there are a lot of places in the world that didn't recognize human rights. And there were people in Germany in that time, not Mr. Bismarck, but Mr. Hitler, who thought it was okay to kill people, mass numbers of people. When it was over, the United Nations, under the leadership of Mr. Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt and other leaders around the world, wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which begins, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed by their Creator with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Brotherhood. It sounds a lot like the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, doesn't it? And since I left government, I've been working, Inclusion International, there are 8 disability organizations recognized by the United Nations in the whole world. And Inclusion International is the one that represents people with intellectual disabilities and their families. There is no other disability organization that represents families. So physical disability, all the sensory disabilities, psychiatric labels, all of those. There's no family anywhere in there. We recognize at a world level that when you're talking about people with intellectual disabilities and related disabilities, developmental disabilities, autism, you are talking about families. Because around the world and in the United States, the biggest challenge of having a son or daughter with a disability is you're in it for life, man. My son Charlie was born in 1982, wasn't really diagnosed till 1983. But Charlie was really, really, really disabled. And so now when I run into these people who want to say, oh, well, my child has profound autism, severe and profound autism, it's very different from all of the other people who have autism. I'm like, you know, that's not really true. You can have kinds of disability. You can be more disabled, but you're mostly disabled by how people treat you, not by what your characteristics are. We tried to treat Charlie just like his brothers. So should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Who in the room has a brother? It is not always pretty, is it? Am I right? I mean, my youngest son said, every brother is an asshole sometimes, even if he has a disability. Am I right? That's the beauty of family and intellectual disability. There is a kind of acceptance that goes beyond the nicey nice, oh, aren't you sweet, kind of nonsense that you get elsewhere in the world. And it's real. And I assured my youngest son, Eric, that Charlie thought he was an asshole sometimes also. The fact that there is now the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is really important. We came together around the world. I was in the room, 400 advocates in wheelchairs, geniuses, writing this document. They wrote a piece on legal capacity that said, the person with a disability will always represent themselves and never be allowed to have a guardian or power of attorney, or no one else will ever represent them. They will just do it themselves. And I kept raising my hand because I wanted to say, you know, that wouldn't work for my family. And they wouldn't call on me. So I asked them afterwards, why did you not call on me? And they said, you're just a mom. Dude, who's a mom in the room? Like, my hair was on fire. And so I was invited to come back to the next caucus where they were writing the convention and be on a panel with people who had intellectual disability. And I brought Charlie. They said, if you want to be heard, you have to bring him and let him speak for himself. Now, Charlie never spoke a word in his life, not one. And he didn't use a communication device. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't figure it out. He was born in '82. It just didn't work. But we brought him to the UN. My other son was working for Mayor Bloomberg at the time, so he met us and came with us. And Charlie's assistant, Zach is like 6'6" and used to play professional rugby in New Zealand, right? Shaved head, used to play football for Kansas, poor guy. Nice guy. Anyway, we went to New York and we went to the UN, and I stood up in front and said, you told me if I brought Charlie, he would speak for himself. And I don't think this legal capacity language that you have is going to work for a lot of people in the world. If you leave it like this, you might as well call this the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Minor Inconveniences. You know, if you just use a wheelchair, nobody's going to question. Maybe they will, but. So anyway, I said if you told me that I wanted Charlie to be heard, I should bring him and let him speak for himself. So Charlie, I put his chair out in the middle of the stage, and I put on the brakes, and I said, Charlie, what do you got to say? This was the longest 2 minutes of my life. He looked at his hand a little bit, and he kind of shook his head back and forth. He wasn't, I don't think he was anxious. He didn't seem uptight or sad or anything, but he just sat there and kind of looked at them, and they looked at him. And then I said, you know, I just had kind of an epiphany, because you told me if I brought him, he would speak for himself, and I think he just did. Now, do you have the ability to have heard what he said? Right? And they changed the language that day to add supported decision-making to this United Nations treaty. I think that maybe have been the most important thing I ever did. The most important thing I ever did was to shut up, stand back, and put him in front. And it was an epiphany for me that by treating him with dignity and respect, but allowing him to be as fully disabled as he was in front of other people, it was helping to make a key point that I could never have made just talking to them. So here's my challenge to you. When you empower your voice, think about who you need to bring with you. When you're going to the governor's office, when you're going to meet with Senate staffers in North Dakota, who needs to come with you? And don't try to make up for their disability. Let them be as disabled as they are. I don't see anybody in the room who I see folks with a lot of disabilities. But by now, my son Charlie would be making noise. And I don't see anybody making any noise.
Really?
Yeah. Do you like to make noise?
Yeah, he likes to know.
Okay. Well,
Comically insane.
well, that's a good question. Let's talk afterwards, okay? He asked me whether someone who was comically insane was disabled. And I think that's a great question, and I hope we can talk right afterwards. So here I am. I've been a Kennedy Fellow. I've been on the Hill. I've been in charge of all these organizations. I've been a White House appointee. And finally, I learned the lesson to stand behind Charlie instead of in front of Charlie. You know why? Because in America, and God bless Ronald Reagan, he started the whole waiver program. God bless him for that. But the waiver program is built on the idea of individual responsibility. It came from Margaret Thatcher and that whole economic piece that says that the market can solve all problems and that, you know, each of us has to have individual responsibility. That's where we got welfare reform from. All of that stuff came out of the 80s. And that's what I learned as an advocate. I learned that it was my responsibility as Charlie's mother to make his life good. It was my responsibility to go to the school and argue with them about inclusive education. It's my responsibility to sit on boards. And by the way, raise your hand if you sit on a board or a special ed committee. When you join a new one, quit an old one. That's my best advice to you. You can do it all, just not all at once. That's a piece of advice mothers seldom get. We're just told to keep, just work harder and everything will be better. So individual responsibility became kind of my enemy. And frankly, it's a problem with the whole service system now. When we have individual budgets for everyone on a waiver, what happens to the community? Who's funding the community to get stronger? And the community is what's under us. And yes, we need an individual budget to solve individual problems, but we would have fewer individual problems if the community were already more supportive or inclusive in the first place. So why do we need family support? Well, because we used to have families who all lived together. I mean, my grandma lived with us for a decade. And she would go and live with my other cousins and come back to us and say, well, why can't you behave as well as they do? And I didn't find out until after she died that she would say the same thing to them. Why I can't? But there were relatives. I mean, in Red Wing, Minnesota, where I was born, my grandmother was one of 10 children who all lived within 20 miles of each other their whole lives. So family support wasn't a question. It's really a question now. And a Republican governor of Minnesota, Arne Carlson, really recognized this, that if he wasn't funding family support, he was just throwing money down the rat hole because it has such a big payoff for helping families to really do what needs to be done with their son or daughter. And if you're not funding it, then everything starts to go to hell, and now you have to pay more to try to fix stuff. It was a no-win. Not to mention how much more expensive the waiver program became when we didn't have family support funded. Should we fund family support for moral reasons? Hell yes. Families deserve support. And I don't mean family support as we're just going to fund the parents so that they can take care of the poor disabled person. The disabled person is a powerful member of a family. Powerful. And when we fund family support, we need to think of the whole family together and how we can bring them all together. Now, this is something that that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities really recognizes. And we do not recognize it in the United States. I mentioned the Declaration, I didn't mention the Constitution. We have probably the oldest democracy in the world. Our Constitution was written in the early 18th century. In the early 18th century, people thought of human rights as consisting of civil rights and political rights. You recognize those from our Constitution. It's the right to sue the government when they take something away from you, and the right to advocate, the right to join groups and go and advocate for change in the political system. Really important rights, really important. We hang our entire hat on that. All of our disability heroes are people who have carried signs and screamed at governors and done political organizing. We're constantly having to go back in and save programs that we depend on because some administrator decides it would be better if they just cut it off. Social Security, Medicaid, special ed. Well, let's just reduce the budget for all of these things. And so we have to go fight for it and keep it. And we do that using our political rights, and then those are our heroes. God bless. I'm glad we have those heroes. Other countries in the 19th century, other democracies, added social and economic rights to their constitutions. Some of those were kind of crazy. Those are the communist countries. Some of them are brilliant, like the socialist constitution of Germany, of Sweden, of Norway, of Finland, of Iceland, of Denmark. The people that we recognize, frankly. Okay, raise your hand if you've got some Norwegian blood. My people. And that's really important. And then there are two more aspects of human rights that later democracies in the 20th century added: dignity and cultural rights. Dignity is so important. Dignity means not asking a family to fail before you give it support. It means not asking a child to fail in school before you give him the supports that he needs to be able to succeed. It means not making people crawl on their hands and knees to beg for something that they need just to live a decent life. Also means recognizing people in civil service, the people who work in government, who are trying really hard to get stuff done, and not denigrating them because they happen to work for government. It means not screaming at each other. In America in 2023, I am just really surprised that we have to talk about how can we live without screaming at each other. And I think people with disabilities have some of the answers to that. Because we have some pretty fundamental problems that can't be solved by screaming. They can only be solved by careful attention and discussion and planning. So in the disability world in the United States, when we first started looking at what are we going to do about disability, our first response was a medical one. So John Kennedy, when he was president, started the President's Commission on Mental Retardation, and they were a bunch of doctors who sat around the table and said, well, what can we do to help cure mental retardation so it goes away? And John Kennedy's mother, Rose, thought that they were going to get rid of, quote, mental retardation. And the university-affiliated programs were begun to try to bring doctors into our big state institutions where they could try to figure out how to improve these patients' lives. Medical model, right? Now, some disability advocates now say, well, we have a medical model and a social model, and the medical model is old and you shouldn't use that anymore, and the social model is the new paradigm. I disagree with this enormously. I have had back surgery, and I very much wanted the medical method to be in place for that. I wanted to have a nice MRI and a really good surgeon, and there are certain things in your life that you need a medical method to address. When you're doing healthcare advocacy, you are advocating for experts to be able to deal with individual persons in a non-discriminatory way. This week, I don't know if you saw it, but there's a new announcement about Section 504 of the Rehab Act coming out of the Administration for Community Living in the Department of Health and Human Services that says, no, we won't give federal funding anymore to organizations that discriminate against people with disabilities in healthcare. So if a woman who uses a wheelchair can't get a mammogram because she can't stand up at the torture machine, then we're not going to fund that hospital if that's what they're doing. They have to have exam tables that are movable so that someone can transfer onto it if they have trouble with transferring. These kinds of, or they have to have sign language and other things for, you'd think that that would be already in place. It's not. We've been working on that for 20 years that I know of, but this new ACL rule that just came out, you can look it up. I think it will have some power behind it. So the medical method is not something that we should be using to look at a person with a disability and say, dude, I can fix you, man. Just sit down here and do what I told you to do, and I can make you into a whole different person. That doesn't feel very good, right? I mean, I don't think my son Charlie wanted to be fixed either. He kind of liked somebody rolling him around and peeling him a grape all the time. When the medical method doesn't work, as a nation and as human beings, we went to a rehab method, which is, guess we can't get rid of this disability. Let's see if we can accommodate it. So, can't figure out a way to make you walk, so I'm going to figure out a way to get you a wheelchair that works for you. And as a nation, first we had the NIH doing all the medical stuff, and then we had IDEA and the Rehab Act in the mid-70s, which were both focused on accommodations. How do we help somebody do what we want them to do? Really great, really important. There are countries around the world that would give anything to have what we have in our Education Act and in our Rehab Act. On the other hand, how many people in the room got up this morning and said, well, I wonder what the government wants me to do today? And that's what the Rehab Act helps you with. Can't feed yourself? Well, we want you to feed yourself, so here's a special kind of spoon that you can use. Can't tie your shoes? We want you to be able to do that. Here's some Velcro. Can't walk? Here's a wheelchair. All that kind of stuff, really important. But it quickly moved us into a different method, and I think most of you in this room have already made this move for yourselves, which is to a rights method, which is to say, I have the right to participate equally with all other Americans in everything. And that's the ADA. That's when the ADA came forward. It's very different from the other laws. There isn't a program, there isn't a budget, there's just a set of rules. And everyone in our community is supposed to recognize those rules. It's meant to drive cultural change. I told you earlier about dignity and cultural rights. Cultural rights, people think it means, oh, you have the right to practice whatever your minority culture is. That's not what it means. It means that, but it means more than that. It means you have the right to participate equally in all of the advances in your culture. So if some people in North Dakota have broadband, you should all have broadband. If some people in North Dakota have access to human services or family support services, you should all have that. Really hard to do when there's a lot of rural space anywhere, because it's hard to figure out how do you distribute this stuff. It's even harder to do if you never think about it. And that's something that you have to get used to, saying, we have the right to non-discrimination. We have the right to participate equally with everyone else. It can be one of the things that really empowers your voice. Instead of looking at the laws and figuring out how do you fit into the law, instead you look at your life and figure out how can you make the systems understand where you want to fit in your life. Do you have the right to equal health care? The CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, put a lot of effort into talking about gender equality in health care for people with disabilities. Why? Well, in a state like North Dakota, which probably is getting more and more opposed to abortion in any instance, they would probably be surprised to know that women with disabilities are still given abortions against their wishes, or are sterilized against their wishes, or do not have health care, have never been asked whether they have been raped, have never been asked whether they need support to be secure in their sexuality. These are really tough issues. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is easy to understand. If you look it up online, you can go through it and read it. I think I have this project in mind, and if some of you work for the state, I'm going to dump it here. I've talked to several states, and several of them, including a couple of Republican states, have said, that's really interesting. The Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities looks at the lives of people with disabilities, not in the silos of our service systems. So we measure outcomes in early childhood, in school, in healthcare, in employment, in all of these different silos, and nothing cuts across them. So if you fail to provide early intervention or you fail to provide family support, and then you segregate a child in school for 12 years, guess what? The outcomes, when he goes to live in the community, it's going to be worse. It's going to be worse, because he's never had a chance to learn how to be who he is with everybody else. And on the other hand, if we looked across all of those areas and said, hey, we could expect things to be better if we integrate our thinking on all of these systems, I think, A, your systems would be much more respectful of human rights. And B, here's the Republican argument, they would be a lot more efficient. You wouldn't be wasting money on stuff that's actually hurting people. That's the problem with the silos. It's not just that, oh, we're not fully accountable for everything we're doing. We're spending money to hurt people. And that is a bad idea. So anyway, my project idea is get some people together from state governments to work on, we have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We signed it as a nation. Signing it is supposed to indicate that we intend to operate according to its principles, but we didn't ratify it. That means nobody in this room can complain to the UN about how you're treated in the United States with your disability. Okay. And other countries have to make annual reports of how they're doing, what kind of progress are they making. Well, we could be taking the convention and sitting down with it and saying, what kind of progress are we making in these areas of the lives of people with disabilities? We don't need to ratify it in order to do that. We could do that because, you know, in the Paris Accords on the climate change stuff, President Trump pulled us out of all of that, and a whole bunch of states and cities stepped forward and said, well, if you're not going to do it as a nation, then we're going to do it as a state. And you can do that. You just can't sign a treaty if you're a state. But you can certainly work on international goals as a state. Why do I think that's important? Because North Dakota, you know, you look like you're in a box, but you're not in a box. You're part of the US. You're part of the world. There are people moving in here and moving from North Dakota to go somewhere else in the world. It's not closed off here. So being aware of what the international agreements are about how people should be treated is a really interesting prospect. Believe me, there are just as many of you in this room, and you are just as smart as people in any other state who might come together and look at the convention in a serious way and say, how would this apply to us? Now, if you start doing that with people with disabilities, sorry, one sec, okay. We have, Inclusion International has a tool that might be useful to you, and it might be useful to you in other parts of your life as well. That tool is called Listen, Include, Respect, and if you go online and just go to listenincluderespect.com, it's a set of guidelines for how to accommodate people with intellectual and related disabilities in meetings and in processes and in general democracy. And the guidelines were developed in consultation with 1,600 organizations of people with intellectual disabilities around the world. I mean, this is no small thing. We're now in the process of writing a contract with the United Nations to use these guidelines to help them improve their meetings. I think you'll find that they're pretty down-to-earth suggestions and pretty much stuff that you could do in your organizations if you just took a look at them. It's not that hard to figure out how to do it differently. So, empower your voice. You're supposed to be integrating healthcare advocacy and the other disability advocacy that you do. You know, I want to go to something kind of fundamental. The idea of an IQ test determining whether you're eligible for a waiver or not in North Dakota is way old-fashioned. It's a very old-fashioned idea. Most places don't even use IQ tests anymore. There's a lot of good evidence that IQ tests are kind of bogus in the first place. Instead, it's more modern if you use a functional definition of what kind of support does someone need to get through their day and to get through their life. Most states have gone to that, to a DD definition, which is a functional definition. Really important piece. And those of you who do pass the IQ sniff test, if you can go in and say, I don't want to live in a state where other people who have almost the same disabilities as me can't get waiver supports because they got too many points on the IQ test. That doesn't really make sense. I mean, probably one of the most important arguments is to say, let's help somebody else get what they need. That doesn't mean that we get less. It's not pie, right? It's not that we want to keep everything for ourselves. And sometimes in advocacy, that happens. We're taught, this is going back to the individual responsibility idea, but we're taught, oh, I represent people with intellectual disabilities, or I represent people who live in this county, or I represent, I don't know what else. The best advocacy I ever did wasn't that kind of categorical advocacy. So when my Charlie was a little guy, he was in a segregated school for his early intervention on the other side of Minneapolis from my house. So he spent 45 minutes on the bus. He couldn't hold his head up, but he spent 45 minutes on the bus every day going there, and then 45 minutes coming home at night. And after the first week, you know, Charlie had this puff of blonde hair. My nickname for him was Puff. And this beautiful little smile. And after a week of going to that school, he came home and he would smile like this. And I thought, Jesus, is he having a seizure or what's the deal? What's wrong? His smile is completely different after 1 week. I better go to the school and see what's happening. Is something happening to him? So I went to the school, and after lunch, they put him and this other little guy in prone standers right next to each other, looking out the windows. And the other little guy had cerebral palsy, and he smiled like this. And so, ding, 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 the light bulb goes on. So I said to the teacher, you know, when he's at home, he learns from his big brother, and his little brother sometimes, the asshole. And when he's at school, obviously he's learning from this kid next to him. So why don't I want him in a school with other kids who are doing all the stuff we want him to be doing? You know, sitting up straight, paying attention, using his hands, all that stuff. And she said, oh my God, you're going to get me fired. And she handed me an application to Partners in Policymaking and said, I've been trying to make this school more inclusive and I keep getting in trouble for it, but why don't you go do this program instead? And before I even started Partners, Charlie was finally in a classroom in his normal school, the regular school in our neighborhood where his brother went. And it was a segregated classroom for kids with disabilities. I think they had like 15 kids in this little classroom. And he was 7 years old by that time. So I walked down the hall to the teacher who had been Will's second grade teacher, because I thought she was really good. And I said, Joan, could he come down to be in your class for story hour? I know you do story time after lunch for 10 minutes or something. Could he just come and join you for that? And I think he would really enjoy it. He likes to be read to at home. And she said, yeah, sure, we'll come and get him. No need to change the IEP, it'll be fine. She calls me up at work 2 weeks later. Sue, it's Joan. I need a favor. Now, I'm a parent advocate, so I'm thinking, holy hell, you couldn't handle 10 minutes of story time. And she said, no, I need a favor. The kids don't want him to go back to that little room. They think it's sad. Would it be okay with you if he stayed with us all afternoon? No, I didn't say yes. I said, Joan, as a special favor to you, he can stay all afternoon. And because that's what I wanted in the first place. 2 weeks later, she called me and said, the kids told her, we do science in the morning, and they think he would like science, so would it be okay with you if he came with us all day long? Yep, that's fine with me. She said, don't worry about it, we'll fix it, we don't need the IP, we'll just talk to the special ed teacher and get it straightened out. So all of the advocacy that I had been doing until he was 7 years old was obliterated and superseded by the advocacy of other 7-year-olds who could see what was fair and what was right. And then next year, we didn't have a special ed room in that school. All of those kids were in the regular classrooms. And everybody's test scores went up. Not everybody who was a kid with a disability. Everybody in the school. Every kid without a disability, their test scores went up. Can we trace it completely to inclusion? If we could have done that, I would be making a lot more money now. But morally, is it the right thing to do? Do you know what the earliest sign of giftedness is in a child? It's not that he reads early or that he can do math early. It's that he has a strong sense of social justice. It's that little kid who's always standing there going, that's not fair. That's your kid. That's the gifted kid. So when you take some kids and segregate them in a school, put them in a different room or let them be bullied or in any way put them in the other category, you're hurting every child in that school, including the ones who are the most gifted. You're spending money to do harm. I think North Dakota could change the United States. I think, well, okay, so we have what, about as many people as Wyoming? Is that right? Maybe a few more? A few more than DC? Have a hard time getting DC advocates together in a room like this, because DC is a very segregated city, and people in the Southeast wouldn't talk to people in the Northwest, and it's minuscule. It's as big as one of your counties, but one of your small counties. But North Dakota could show the way to how can we work together to change the system so that everybody has what they need. You don't have to leave the fact that you need family support to families to advocate for it. Self-advocates can advocate for it. Ordinary citizens can advocate for it. If Charlie's second grade classroom could advocate for switching the whole system to be inclusive, there's nobody in this room who can't step up and say we need a better system of family support in North Dakota. And there probably isn't anything that would more fundamentally change how people with disabilities are treated in North Dakota, more importantly than ensuring that family support is available to everyone. We live in a country that since 9/11, and since, God help us, since the COVID pandemic, loneliness is an epidemic for us now. People are lonely. People are in their home watching TV or on their phone, and they don't have human contact with another person. They don't have anybody in their life who is coming around to them saying on a daily basis, you matter. You matter to me. I want to see you. Maybe we could get together and have a couple of people do laundry together. How exciting is that? But if, like me, you were doing 2 loads of laundry every day in your house just to try to keep up, maybe it is exciting. Or maybe you're the woman who has the big washer and dryer, and another woman has to do a lot of laundry, but she has to go to a laundromat to do it. Well, invite her to your house. Make a cup of tea. Say, hey, what? Come on over and do some laundry. Well, or what else can we think of that we can do to connect to each other in a real way in our lives? You guys look like friends. You look like you know each other pretty well and can call each other up. I have a few of those friends from back home. There's one group of us that used to walk around a lake in Minneapolis every Saturday morning. And I mean, when it was 20 below, we were out there dressed like the Michelin Man walking around the lake. And it was great, because we could agree that our kids are driving us nuts and we love them to bits. Really important. If you're in the individual responsibility role, you think you can't really say that your kid is driving you nuts. Right? You think it's not Christian. But I'm telling you, it might be real. And you need to get out of the house sometimes. We all happen to have husbands who stayed home with the boys while we all went out for this walk. Oh, and then we went for breakfast and coffee. So we went for the walk at 7 in the morning. We didn't get home until noon, but still. But it was my sanity check-in for all of those years. One woman wrote a book coming out of it called Changed by a Child, which is a set of daily affirmations for parents of children with disabilities. And it's a lovely book, but it's one little paragraph for each day. I asked her why. Barbara, how come it's such a short little paragraph? And she said, well, because have you ever taken a book to bed and you fall asleep after you read one paragraph? Yeah. I said, yep, every night that's what I do. But how do we recognize those realities in our lives? And how do we recognize that we have a need to speak up more than we're being invited to speak up? Right? We wish we could stand on a soapbox at the school or at the city council meeting or someplace else. We don't want to have a fight. We don't want to have somebody take our name and have people with red hats call us and make threatening remarks to us. We just want to get the reality out there. We want to tell the truth about what is it like to live in North Dakota with a disability. Now, it's not different than living in South Dakota. It's not different than living in East Dakota, AKA Minnesota. It might be a little different. We have a pretty good family support system in Minnesota. It might be a little different. And you don't have to make North Dakota the same as every other place in order for it to be good. But you have to start thinking about how do we meet the needs not only of the people who are in this room today, but of young parents who might have a 1-year-old child at home that they just got a diagnosis for. How are they going to have their needs met? How are they going to connect to adult siblings of people with disabilities who already know a lot and probably are the same age as the young parents are? I'm really worried about that part of our movement, that we're not making that connection. You guys should have partnerships with all kinds of young families because you can show them that life is pretty good. And that's something I say to human services groups all the time, which is you have the chance to build services and supports. You don't even know the lives you're changing. If you're offering services and supports that allow someone with a significant disability to live fully included in the community with dignity, there might be some young parent who sees that, who says, oh, that's not so bad. This is going to be okay. There might be somebody who sees it who doesn't even have a child yet. But a couple years from now, they might say, you know, I saw that one place where everything was kind of nice. you have a chance to change the world just by doing a really good job at what you do. If you can provide special education services so that the child with disability is not stigmatized, but is recognized as having tremendous strengths. I mean, frankly, I think the scores all went up in Charlie's school. This sounds terrible, but I think he held down the bottom of the class. So none of the other kids had to worry that they were the worst reader in class. They stuttered, they stumbled over words, they could still read to Charlie, and he was grateful for it. One of them told me one day, Charlie is my best friend ever. I said, really? He was in 4th grade. I said, what makes him your best friend? And this little guy said, I tell him all of my secrets and everything that I worry about, and he has never told anybody. But disability has that kind of power. The actual definition of a community is someplace where somebody needs a little help and somebody else knows who that is. And so my neighborhood, boy, I'm not sure I know who needs a little help. Sometimes, I have a snow rake because I used to live in Minnesota, so I can rake the snow off the rooftops. And one year I was like the star of the block because I brought it around and said, you want to use this a little bit? Because we had like 3 feet of snow. Stuff like that happens sometimes. But I'm not saying that disability is the centerpiece of life, but it's an ordinary part. My Charlie, when he moved out of our house, moved into a house, this would be another good project for you guys to copy. The Maryland Inclusive Housing Commission builds housing for people who need wheelchair space and lots of support and other stuff. They do rehabs in Maryland, funded by the Housing Commission. So Charlie rented, he had 2 roommates, 2 housemates, and they each paid rent 1/3 of their Social Security as a housing voucher, a project voucher. And that meant they controlled the house. So in a group home, you don't control the house. The agency controls the house. And if there's a problem, the agency can write to you and say, you know what, we're going to send you home. You're not going to live here anymore. Even if there's not a problem, they can do that. Charlie's house, they couldn't do that. Charlie's house, if there was a problem, he stayed there, and we brought in a different service agency to provide supports to him. Really important philosophical difference. And this Maryland Inclusive Housing Group will help you talk to the Housing Authority about how to change that in your approach. Housing authorities usually think that accessible housing means an apartment with a wide door and a grab bar in the bathroom. Yeah, bingo. It's not enough. It's not enough for most people with disabilities. Charlie moved into this house and he lived a few years before he died. He had a guy doing his day supports. He flunked out of any of the day programs because he was too disabled. They wouldn't take him. They wouldn't let him in. Some of them, he couldn't get in because they had stairs. Anyway, he had a day support guy who said, would you mind if Charlie and I would walk dogs? And I said, no, Charlie's afraid of dogs. And he said, do you mind if we try? And by this time in Charlie's life, I had learned to try. So I said, nope, don't mind if you try. Go ahead, give it a shot. And the first week, Charlie just was like this in his wheelchair when Nate was holding the dog. And at the end of the first week, Charlie reached out and grabbed the leash and wouldn't let go. And so they started walking dogs. In that neighborhood, they started walking around and noticing anybody who had a dog and said, hey, how about if we give you a demonstration? We'll take your dog for the next half hour and show you that we can do it. And $10 for 30 minutes of dog walking. At one time, I did say to them, you do know about substantial gainful employment. I don't want him to make too much money. But he made enough money to go to the movies and buy some Starbucks and whatever. When he died, he had the keys to 13 of his neighbors' houses in a drawer in his bedroom because he and his assistant were walking their dogs, 13 dogs. And a couple of those were little old ladies who couldn't afford to pay, so they would give him figs or raspberries or whatever. And I mean, give back, right? And then the rest of the time they delivered Meals on Wheels in the neighborhood because, you know, nothing perks you up if you're an old person like having a really significantly disabled guy come to your house with your lunch. Maybe it's not so bad after all. There were 350 people at his funeral. I only knew about half of them. The rest were people that Charlie had met and known living in the community. And they weren't all people that he had their key. I don't have any of my neighbors' keys, by the way. I mean, I think it's very rare for a young person to have that many keys to people's houses. And they trusted him with their dogs. You realize the market for pet care is approximately equal to the market for human services, right? I'm not kidding. So, I guess that's my key argument is, yes, we live in a time of tremendous division and argument and even meanness. I mean, it's not just the MAGA hat guys who are mean. I look at them and I think, you're an animal. And I'm trying to teach myself to say, you know, there's pain behind that. There's pain behind their grievance. And there has to be some way to reach them with kindness that would help overcome their desire to just hurt other people. There has to be. But it's hard for me. I'm working at it. But post 9/11 and then post-COVID, we live in an America where we're really separate from each other in really significant ways, where we used to be much closer. And even, I read an article about kids in high school now that they don't just hang out. And I was thinking back to high school. I don't even know which clique I was in. I used to hang out with so many kids doing different things at different times. And were they my best friends? No. Were they kids I hung out with? Well, there were a whole bunch of real nerdy boys who had a computer club. And I was trying to learn about computers. I was no good at it and had to leave, but still, they let me in for a while. I mean, you know, where do we connect anymore to people who are not like us? Where do we connect to people who are like us? The beautiful thing about disability is it cuts across all categories. There are people who wear MAGA hats who have a kid with a disability. There are people who wear MAGA hats who have a brother with a disability. And I don't want to say that that's the only enemy that we have. There are people who just moved here, who don't understand North Dakota at all, and they have somebody with a disability in their family. And who's going to connect them? How are we going to make that happen? So don't just be so damn Norwegian all the time, right? I told a group full of people one day, you know how you can tell a Norwegian extrovert? They look at your shoes while they're talking to you. Right? So today and tomorrow, I hope you have a chance to get to know each other. I hope you have a chance to sit in a room and say, I think this is a problem that we have that I would like to try to fix. And who else has that problem? And how can we work together to try to fix it? And how can we knock on the door at the governor's mansion? How can we go in to meet with people in the administration and say not, we demand that you fix this for us, but we would like to offer ourselves to you to help find a solution to this problem that you may not even know is bad. How do we make sure that civil servants have the data that they need? How do we make sure that politicians have the political cover that they need? You know, they can't just snap their fingers and change their mind. They need to bring people along. How do we help them do that? We're not talking about easy stuff here, guys. That's why I'm talking to the disability community, because I know the disability community is a powerhouse. It really is. So thank you for your time today. I am sue.swenson@gmail.com. If I can do anything for you,